The end of World War I in 1918 was a momentous occasion that marked the end of one of the most devastating conflicts in history. The war had torn through Europe and beyond, leaving an indelible scar on the political, social, and cultural fabric of the nations involved. Yet with the conclusion of the war came a sense of relief and optimism, a desire to rebuild and redefine the world in the aftermath of such chaos. The period that followed the war came to be known as the Roaring Twenties, and it was a decade of unprecedented change, innovation, and cultural explosion across the globe. America, England, and France stood at the forefront of this new world, ushering in an era of jazz speakeasies, flapper dresses, and new freedoms. It was a time of economic prosperity in America, a time of societal rebellion in England, and a time of artistic revolution in France. While the world had been shattered by the Great War, the Roaring Twenties was a decade that sought to rebuild and reimagine life itself. As the world emerged from the dark years of war, it was clear that the landscape of global power had shifted. America stood tall as the dominant economic force, while England and France worked to reclaim their positions in the global order. While each nation experienced the effects of the war differently, all three would be marked by the social and cultural changes that would define the decade. It was a time when the old order was challenged and the foundations of modern society were laid. In America, the Roaring Twenties was a period of immense social and cultural change. The country had been thrust into the spotlight as the leading economic power in the world following the war. The United States had come out of the conflict largely unscathed, while Europe struggled to rebuild. America's prosperity was evident in its booming economy. The 1920s saw the rise of consumerism, mass production, and the emergence of a new middle class. This period of economic boom was accompanied by a cultural shift towards modernity and individualism. The era's iconic jazz music was emblematic of this cultural revolution, as was the rise of the flapper woman, a symbol of freedom, independence, and rebellion against the traditional gender, roles that had defined women's lives for generations. Women cut their hair short, donned revealing dresses, and drank in public, defying the social norms that had previously confined them to domesticity. In cities like New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles, nightclubs, speakeasies, and theaters buzzed with excitement as jazz music rang through the air. For many, the Roaring Twenties was a time of indulgence and excess. The economic boom of the era allowed for a lifestyle of luxury and freedom as people flocked to the city to take part in the excitement of modern life. However, this period of prosperity would not last forever and was soon followed by the Great Depression, which would drastically alter the trajectory of the 1930s. Despite this, however, the Roaring Twenties remains a symbol of a time when America was at the height of its economic and cultural power, and a glimpse into the future of modernity that would shape the decades to come. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic in England, the Roaring Twenties represented a time of societal upheaval and cultural experimentation. The aftermath of World War I had left the country scarred both economically and emotionally. Yet the decade brought a sense of renewal as the country began to grapple with the social changes brought on by the war. The war had decimated a generation of young men, leaving women to take on new roles in society and in the workforce. Women's suffrage had been achieved in 1918, and as the decade progressed, women in England began to push the boundaries of traditional gender roles, just like their American counterparts. English women embraced the flapper style with short bobbed hair and daring fashion choices. The decade also marked a time of rebellion against the Victorian ideals that had previously dominated English society. The arts flourished with the rise of the modernist movement and the emergence of figures like Virginia Woolf and T.S. Eliot, who challenged traditional forms of literature and art. The theater also saw a shift as new playwrights like Noel Coward and George Bernard Shaw pushed the boundaries of what was considered acceptable on stage. At the same time, the English working class found itself grappling with the economic consequences of the war. While the upper classes reveled in the luxury and indulgence of the era, the working class struggled with unemployment, inflation, and the lingering effects of the war. The decade was also marked by political instability, as the country faced the rise of new political movements, including the Labour Party and the growing threat of communism across Europe. This period of unrest would set the stage for the turbulent decades to come. In France, the Roaring Twenties was a time of cultural and artistic renaissance. Despite the devastation of the war, France was one of the countries that experienced a period of artistic revolution during the 1920s. Paris became the epicenter of creativity and innovation as writers, artists, and intellectuals flocked to the city in search of new ideas and new ways of thinking. The city's cafes became meeting places for the likes of Ernest Hemingway, James Joyce, and Gertrude Stein, who were at the forefront of the modernist movement. The artistic avant-garde flourished as painters like Pablo Picasso and Georges Braque led the way in the development of Cubism. Meanwhile, the world of music saw the rise of the jazz movement, which became deeply intertwined with the cultural life of the city. Paris was no longer simply a center of classical arts, but had become a place where new ideas could take root and blossom. The decade was also marked by the rise of the Lost Generation, a group of American expatriates who had come to France to escape the aftermath of the war and find artistic inspiration. They became a symbol of the disillusionment of the era, a generation that had been scarred by the horrors of war and sought meaning and purpose in the cultural revolution of the 1920s. This group of writers and artists would forever change the cultural landscape of the West, and their works continue to influence literature and art to this day. In conclusion, the Roaring Twenties was a decade that reshaped the world in ways that are still felt today. In America, the decade was defined by prosperity and excess. In England, it was a time of societal change and rebellion, while in France it was marked by artistic revolution. The three countries were all grappling with the effects of war, but each responded in unique ways that would define their paths in the years to come. The Roaring Twenties was a time of cultural awakening, a time when the old world order was challenged and the new world began to take shape. As we look back on this transformative period, it is clear that the Roaring Twenties was not just a fleeting moment in history, but a defining era that shaped the course of the 20th century. The Roaring Twenties in America was a decade marked by immense prosperity and cultural transformation as the United States emerged as the world's leading industrial power, largely untouched by the devastation of World War I. The country entered the decade with a sense of optimism and a belief that the best was yet to come. This economic boom was driven by a combination of technological innovations and mass production techniques that allowed businesses to produce goods faster and more efficiently than ever before. Henry Ford's assembly line revolutionized the automobile industry and made cars more affordable to the average American. The Ford Model T became a symbol of this new age, and the car quickly became an essential part of American life. The automobile not only transformed transportation, but also led to the development of new industries such as gas stations, motels, and roadside diners. As Americans began to drive cars more frequently, the construction of roads, highways, and suburban neighborhoods took off. This new mobility allowed people to live further from their places of work and contributed to the growth of cities and the rise of suburban life. The car represented a shift in how Americans viewed their lives. They no longer had to be confined to the small town they were born in, and the open road promised adventure, freedom, and new opportunities. This new era of consumerism saw a sharp increase in the number of Americans purchasing goods on credit, which became widely available during the decade. People could now buy everything from household appliances to fashion without having to pay up front, which led to the rise of consumer culture. Advertisements played a central role in this consumer-driven economy, and companies began using new techniques to target consumers' desires. For comfort and success, Advertisements promised that happiness could be purchased, and the goods being sold were more than just items. They represented a better life, a more modern life, and a life of abundance. Alongside the economic boom was the cultural shift that took place in American society. The decade saw the rise of the flapper, who became the face of the Roaring Twenties. These young women embraced freedom, independence, and rebellion against traditional gender roles they wore. Short skirts bobbed their hair and danced the Charleston in nightclubs that offered an escape from the rigid social constraints of the past. Women were no longer confined to the home, and with the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920, women gained the right to vote, which symbolized the shifting balance of power in American society. This was a time when women began to embrace their sexual freedom and newfound social status as they became more involved in the workforce. And in political life, the flapper represented the breaking down of barriers for women and marked the beginning of a new era of female empowerment. In tandem with the rise of the flapper was the explosion of jazz music, which became the soundtrack of the era. Originating from African American communities in New Orleans, jazz spread throughout the United States in cities like New York, Chicago, and Harlem jazz clubs and speakeasies, where people gathered to drink illegally during Prohibition. Became hotspots for this new musical style. Jazz became synonymous with the Roaring Twenties. It was bold, fast-paced, and full of energy, just like the decade itself. Legendary musicians such as Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, and Bessie Smith brought jazz into the mainstream, and it became the music of a generation. Jazz represented not just a new genre of music, but a new way of thinking about culture and freedom. It was a celebration of individuality and a rejection of the old rules of the past. Music became a form of liberation for many Americans who felt the constraints of the previous generations. The rise of speakeasies during Prohibition was another hallmark of the Roaring Twenties. Prohibition, which lasted from 1920 until 1933, banned the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcohol. However, instead of decreasing drinking, it had the opposite effect. It led to the rise of illegal bars and clubs where people could gather to drink, socialize, and enjoy jazz music. Speakeasies became an essential part of the culture of the Roaring Twenties. They were places where people could escape the restrictive laws of the time and live more freely. These underground clubs became a symbol of rebellion against authority and the establishment, as the youth of the decade rejected the old rules and embraced a life of excess and excitement. The Roaring Twenties was a time of excess in many ways, as people sought to live life to the fullest with no regard for the consequences. The booming stock market encouraged people to take risks and invest in stocks, which led to an economic bubble that many believed would never burst. People flocked to the stock exchanges eager to make their fortunes. Without considering the risks involved, the stock market became a symbol of the era's optimism, as people believed that the good times would last forever. But this bubble was not sustainable, and the stock market crash of 1929 ended the Roaring Twenties and marked the beginning of the Great Depression. While the decade was marked by economic success for many, it also exposed the flaws of the American economic system. The disparity between the wealthy and the poor grew, and while the rich enjoyed unprecedented prosperity, the working class struggled with low wages and high unemployment. The country was deeply divided, and the social tensions that were simmering beneath the surface of the decade would eventually explode into the social upheavals of the 1930s. Racial tensions were another contradiction of the Roaring Twenties, as African Americans were subjected to discrimination and violence, even as they contributed greatly to the cultural landscape of the time. The Harlem Renaissance was a cultural movement that celebrated African American art, music, literature, and intellectualism, and Harlem became the epicenter of African American culture during the 1920s. Yet, despite the cultural achievements of African Americans, the nation remained deeply segregated, and racism was rampant in both the North and South. The Ku Klux Klan saw a resurgence during the decade, and violence against African Americans was widespread. The Roaring Twenties was a time of cultural revolution, but it was also a time of racial inequality and social unrest. Despite the economic prosperity and cultural change, the decade ended in disaster with the Great Depression, which was triggered by the stock market crash of 1929. The optimism and excess of the Roaring Twenties gave way to the harsh realities of the 1930s as the country faced widespread unemployment, poverty, and hardship. The legacy of the Roaring Twenties, however, lived on as the cultural and social changes of the decade laid the groundwork for the modern America that would emerge in the following decades. The Roaring Twenties was a time when America came into its own as a global power and a cultural force. And its impact is still felt today in everything from music to fashion to politics. It was a time of excess and indulgence, but also of great change and the beginning of a new chapter in American history. For England, the Roaring Twenties was a period marked by societal upheaval, economic struggle, and cultural experimentation. In the wake of World War I, England was a country deeply affected by the devastation of the conflict. The war had cost the country dearly, both in terms of human lives and economic resources. The loss of life was particularly devastating, with entire generations of young men lost in the trenches, leaving a deep scar on the social fabric of the nation. The economic toll of the war was equally severe as England struggled with inflation, unemployment, and the burden of rebuilding after such a catastrophic conflict. Yet despite these challenges, the decade also marked a time of great cultural and social change. The Roaring Twenties was a period in which England sought to redefine itself in the aftermath of the war. The country was no longer the dominant global empire it had been before the war, and the decade was marked by a sense of loss and uncertainty as England tried to find its place in a rapidly changing world. The British Empire itself was beginning to show signs of weakness as the colonies pushed for more autonomy and independence. As the world moved towards a new international order, England found itself struggling to maintain its global power. While the economy was struggling for much of the decade, the cultural landscape of England was undergoing a transformation as well. One of the most notable aspects of the Roaring Twenties in England was the rise of new ideas in art and literature. The modernist movement, which had already begun to take hold in Europe during the war, was in full swing by the 1920s. In literature, writers like Virginia Woolf, James Joyce, and T.S. Eliot began to challenge traditional forms of storytelling and language. Woolf's stream of consciousness technique and Joyce's experimental use of language in works like Ulysses pushed the boundaries of literature and offered a new way of understanding the human experience. These works of modernist literature mirrored the social upheaval of the time as England sought to come to terms with the aftermath of the war. Modernism also took root in the visual arts, with artists like Picasso and Braque influencing British painters. The decade saw the rise of avant-garde art movements that rejected traditional artistic conventions and sought to express the new realities of the post-war world. The art world in England became more experimental, with new forms of expression emerging that would shape the future of modern art. Theater also played a role in this cultural revolution, with playwrights like George Bernard Shaw and Noel Coward pushing the boundaries of what was considered acceptable on stage. Their works often dealt with social issues and challenged the rigid class system that had defined English society for centuries. The theater became a space for social and political commentary as well as for artistic innovation. At the same time, the Roaring Twenties was a time of great political change in England. The war had led to the rise of the Labour Party, which began to gain more influence in the decade. The working class, which had been severely affected by the war, was beginning to demand more rights and better working conditions. Strikes and protests became more common as the working class pushed for social and economic reforms. The Labour Party's rise to power signaled a shift away from the old political order and a move toward more progressive policies. This was also the decade that saw women's suffrage achieved in England, with women over the age of 30 gaining the right to vote in 1928. This was a significant milestone in the struggle for women's rights in England and marked a change in the way women were viewed in British society. Women began to enter the workforce in greater numbers, and their roles in society began to shift as they gained more political power. The changes in gender roles during the Roaring Twenties were not limited to the suffrage movement. Women in England began to adopt the flapper style, which had been popularized in America with short bobbed hair and knee-length dresses. They also began to embrace new forms of social freedom by going to nightclubs and participating in activities that had previously been reserved for men. This new era of women's liberation was symbolic of the broader cultural shift taking place in England during the decade. Despite these cultural and social advancements, however, England was still grappling with the aftermath of the war and the difficult economic conditions that persisted throughout the decade. The country was in the midst of rebuilding, but the task was daunting. The social divisions between the rich and poor remained deeply entrenched with the working class struggling to make ends meet while the upper classes continued to live in relative comfort. The disparity between the rich and the poor fueled tensions and dissatisfaction among the working class, which would come to a head in the following decades. The economic struggles of the 1920s were compounded by political instability as the country faced economic stagnation and high unemployment. The specter of communism loomed large in the minds of the British government as the success of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia in 1917 and the rise of socialist movements in Europe inspired fear of revolution in Britain. The British working class was radicalized by the war and by the social and economic conditions that followed. The growth of labor unions and the increasing popularity of socialist ideas led to fears of class conflict and revolution in England. The fear of communism and socialism led to political repression and attempts to suppress labor movements through legal and political means. The government also sought to maintain the status quo by clinging to the old imperial traditions that had once given England its power. Despite the turmoil, the Roaring Twenties in England was also a time of great creativity and innovation in the arts and culture. It was a time when the country began to break free from its Victorian past and explore new possibilities for the future. The challenges faced by England during the decade, however, set the stage for the political and social upheavals of the 1930s, which would change the course of the nation's history. As the world moved into the modern age, England's role as a global power was beginning to fade, and the Roaring Twenties marked a moment of transition between the old world and the new one. Despite the economic struggles and political instability, the cultural revolution of the 1920s in England laid the groundwork for the social changes that would follow in the years to come. The impact of the Roaring Twenties on England was profound, and its legacy continued to shape the country long after the decade had passed. Across the Channel in France, the Roaring Twenties marked a time of cultural renaissance. As the country sought to rebuild after the devastation of World War I, Paris became a haven for artists, writers, musicians, and intellectuals from around the world seeking to create new ideas and new forms of expression. The city became the epicenter of the modernist movement, with writers like Ernest Hemingway and F. Scott Fitzgerald gathering in Parisian cafes and exchanging ideas that would go on to shape modern literature. Picasso, Braque, and Matisse revolutionized the art world with movements like Cubism and Fauvism, while jazz music took root in the city and became a symbol of the new cultural freedom and creativity of the era. Paris embraced these new forms of artistic expression, and jazz became synonymous with the Roaring Twenties in France. But the decade was not without its struggles. France was deeply scarred by the war, and the country was facing economic challenges as it worked to rebuild its infrastructure and economy. The war had left a deep psychological mark on the French people, and the country was grappling with the effects of the loss of life and the devastation of the war. France also struggled with political instability, as the effects of the war gave rise to political movements and parties that sought to reshape the country's future. Despite these struggles, however, the cultural explosion of the Roaring Twenties in France left an enduring legacy that continues to shape the world of art, literature, and music today. In conclusion, the Roaring Twenties was a transformative decade that left a lasting legacy on The world America experienced a cultural and economic boom that reshaped the country's social fabric, while England struggled with its post-war identity and the decline of the British Empire. France embraced a cultural renaissance that continues to influence the world today. The Roaring Twenties was a time of cultural revolution, economic excess, and social upheaval, but it was also a time of contradictions that revealed the tensions between progress and inequality. The legacy of the Roaring Twenties continues to shape the cultural and social landscape of the modern world, its impact still felt in everything from music to fashion to politics. The decade may have ended in disaster, but its impact on the arts, politics, and society remains. A defining feature of the modern world, the Roaring Twenties, was more than just a period of excess. It was a turning point in history, one that shaped the course of the 20th century and left a lasting legacy on the world.